Chapter 2.1 The Social World. The world of the first century was not unlike the modern world of the 20th century. Rich and poor, virtuous men and criminals, free men and slaves lived side by side, and the social and economic conditions that prevailed were similar to those of the present day in many respects. The Jewish society. Both in Judaism and in the pagan world there was a wealthy aristocracy. In Judaism it was a religious group, consisting chiefly of the families of the priesthood and of the leading rabbis. The clan of the Hasmoneans had dominated Palestinian society from the days of the Maccabees until the time of Herod the Great. During his reign and during the reigns of his sons the Hasmonean priesthood was in control, and the glimpses of the hierarchy which appear in the Gospels show that they were the virtual rulers of Judea. They controlled the business traffic that was connected with the temple, and they participated in the revenues that were derived from the sale of animals for sacrifice and from the exchange of money involved in the temple taxes. Among the members of the Sanhedrin, which was the high council of Judaism, were well-to-do men like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Probably they were landowners who rented out their farms and profited by a share of the crops. The majority of the Palestinian people were poor. Some were farmers, some were artisans, a few were businessmen. Slavery was not widely practiced in Judaism, and probably the vast majority of the Palestinian Jews were freemen. Some, like the fishermen who became disciples, owned small independent enterprises that supported them fairly well. Social divisions among the Jews were somewhat restrained by the common obligation which the law imposed upon its followers. If they were all equally responsible to God for obedience to it, they were consequently morally equal in his sight. Although the Jew regarded the wealthy man as especially blessed by God's favor, and therefore as righteous, there was no reason why any man should not by good works merit equal favor. While an aristocracy tends to be self-perpetuating, there was at least the inherent moral equality which kept the Jewish oligarchy from becoming too oppressive. Next we have the pagan society. First we will discuss that the aristocracy in the pagan world of the first century, the strata of society were more sharply contrasted. The civil wars of Rome, which had preceded the rise of the Principate, had disrupted the entire social life of the empire. The old free landholding populace of Italy had disappeared. Many of the earlier senatorial families had perished in the party struggles, though some had survived. In their places had risen a new aristocracy, the landholders, who controlled public lands by their influence and who bought cheaply the private lands of those whose families were impoverished by war or by the impossibility of making a living from a small farm. The exploitation of the newly conquered provinces opened another avenue of profit, and the businessmen who acted as government contractors and as speculators reaped an enormous harvest. The consequent luxury enervated the aristocracy and discouraged the lower classes, who found that for all their toil they seemed to prosper less as the years rolled along. Next we have the middle class. Largely because of the rise of slavery, which was built upon the use of military captives, the middle class was almost crushed out of the empire. Many had been killed in the wars and proscriptions. Many others had been unable to meet the competition of slave labor and had slowly been starved out of their small farms and estates. Gradually they swelled the homeless and foodless mobs which filled the great cities, especially Rome, and they became dependent for their sustenance upon the state. The hungry, idle crowds, who would vote for any candidate whose promises sounded better than those of his competitor, were a dangerous and unpredictable factor in the social life of the empire. Next are the plebs. The plebs, or poor people, were numerous and their condition was pitiful. Many lacked steady employment and were worse off than slaves, who had at least assurance of food and of clothing. The unemployed proletariat were ready to follow any man who would give them a dole to feed their stomachs and amusements to while away their idle hours. They were easy prey for demagoguery of every description. Next are the slaves and the criminals. Slaves made up a large proportion of the population of the Roman Empire. No exact figures are obtainable, but probably less than half of the inhabitants of the Roman world were free men, and only relatively few of them were citizens with full rights. War, debt, and birth recruited the ranks of the slave population at a rapid rate. Not all of them were ignorant. Many, in fact, were physicians, accountants, teachers, and skilled artisans of every kind. Epictetus, the renowned Stoic philosopher, was one of them. They performed most of the work in the great agricultural estates. They acted as household servants and as clerks in business houses, and publishers employed them as copyists. Where modern enterprises operate by machinery, the ancients used cheap labor. The effect of slavery was debasing. The ownership of slaves made the masters dependent upon the labor and skill of their servitors to the extent that they lost their own ingenuity and ambition. Morality and self-respect were impossible among those whose only law was the will of an arbitrary master. Trickery, flattery, fraud, and fawning obedience were the slave's best tools to obtain what he wanted from his superiors. In many households, the children were entrusted to the care of these menials who taught them all of the vices and sly tricks that they knew. Thus the corruption that prevailed among the oppressed classes spread to their overlords. Undoubtedly there were many instances of masters and mistresses who treated their servitors kindly, as there were many slaves who labored in the bond of friendship rather than in the bond of fear. Some of them were able to amass a bit of property from tips and gifts, with which they purchased their freedom, and some were manumitted by their masters either during the lifetime of the latter or at death. Consequently, a steady stream of freedmen poured into the life of the empire, filling with trained workers the ranks of the lower and middle classes which had been depleted by the wars. Many of these freedmen, like Pallas under Claudius, became prominent in the government, and were important in the growth of the bureaucracy. The institution of slavery is reflected in the New Testament by the frequent use of the term slave, and by occasional references to the ownership of them. Nowhere in its pages is the institution attacked, nor is it defended. According to Paul's letters to the Asian churches, there were both slaves and slaveholders who were Christians. The slaves were enjoined to obey their masters, and the masters were commanded not to be cruel to them. Such was the power of Christian fellowship, however, that the institution of slavery gradually weakened under its impact and finally disappeared. The restless hordes of the unemployed, the sharpers who made their way to the great cities for the purpose of preying on society, the despairing and the disinherited all made a fertile ground for the breeding of criminals. To say that crime prevailed in the empire might be unfair, for there were a large number of decent citizens, but in consideration of the unscrupulous and immoral character of so many of the emperors and higher officials, it is not surprising that society at large was permeated with all kinds of evils. The ghastly picture of the heathen world that appears in Romans 1:18-32 was not overdrawn. There was no inherent standard in paganism to check the downward moral drift. Next were the cultural attainments. First we have literature. Under Augustus came a literary revival in Rome. Virgil, the poet, became the prophet of the new era. His Aeneid was an attempt to glorify the Rome of Augustus by showing through the epic adventure of his hero the divine origin and destiny of the empire. In his writings the hope of a golden age to come was also reflected, and at least one of the eclogues, the fourth, seems to show that he had some knowledge of the Old Testament. The Augustan age was the golden period of Roman poetry, graced by Horace, who cast Latin poetry in Greek molds, and by Ovid, whose stories of Greek and Roman mythology reveal the contemporary moral attitudes of the Roman people. Nothing of note was produced between the periods of Augustus and of Nero. Seneca, the Stoic moralist and Nero's tutor, wrote philosophic essays and dramatic tragedy. Petronius, the wealthy social arbiter of Nero's court, composed a novel which is still one of the best sources for understanding the common life of his day. In the latter third of the 1st century, Pliny the Elder wrote his Natural History, one of the first attempts at a scientific account of the natural world. It was encyclopedic in scope and showed a vast amount of research, although it was quite uncritical and inadequate when judged by modern standards. Grammar and rhetoric were treated extensively by Quintilian. Martial, whose spicy epigrams still make pungent reading, was the newspaper columnist of his day. Under the governments of Nero, of Trajan, and of Hadrian, literature took the turn of self-criticism. Tacitus in particular, since he was connected with the old republican aristocracy, was not very friendly toward the emperors. The content of his annals and of his histories shows the feeling against the Principate that smoldered under the surface of public opinion. The satirist Juvenal also wrote in the early 2nd century. Like Martial, he was a bitter critic of the manners and morals of his day. Even if it be granted that some of his caricatures are overdrawn, they reveal the prevalent corruption of high Roman society and generally confirm the impression left by his predecessor, Martial. Next was art and architecture. Under the emperors of the 1st century, Rome expanded materially, and new construction was continually going on. Although the Romans were not singularly original in their decorative art, they excelled in producing enduring monuments of utilitarian character. Many of their bridges, aqueducts, theatres, and baths still remain as a witness to the Roman thoroughness in construction. They knew how to use the principle of the arch to good effect and were skilled in building with brick and cement. In ornamental and memorial art they created a great deal of statuary which generally represented persons rather than abstract ideas. Funerary carving on tombs and sarcophagi, busts and equestrian statues of the reigning emperors, and historical sculpture such as the Arch of Titus in Rome were common. Next is music and drama. Music and the stage were committed to entertainment of the mob rather than to stimulating the thought of intellectuals. The Roman stage degenerated rapidly and contributed directly to the moral degradation of the people. The farces and mimes of the early empire were coarse and cheap. Their plots dealt with the lowest kind of life and their presentation was shameless. The theatrical representations of the 1st century AD were far different from those of the great Greek tragedians such as Aeschylus and Euripides, who were almost as much philosophers and theologians as they were playwrights. Music of all kinds was familiar in the empire. Stringed instruments and flutes were used chiefly, but brass, wind instruments, and drums and cymbals were employed occasionally. The lyre and the harp were the most popular instruments. Religious rites and processions were generally accompanied by music, and the aristocracy entertained guests by dinner music which their slaves provided. Next is the arena. The amphitheatre was a more pernicious influence on the Roman public than the stage. The bloody contests between men and beasts or between men and men were promoted by the emperor, or occasionally by aspirants for political office who wished to gain the favor of the crowds. The participants were usually trained gladiators who were slaves, captives of war, condemned criminals, or volunteers who sought fame in the arena as a modern pugilist does. Some of them succeeded in winning favor and fortune for themselves so that they were able to retire to peaceful private life. The majority probably died in the arena. The gladiatorial shows accustomed the audience to the sight of bloodshed, and even whetted their appetite for it. In order to please their patrons, the spectacles became increasingly elaborate and increasingly shocking. If the stage with its coarse mimes and farces schooled the populace in obscenity and lust, the gladiatorial shows glorified brutality. Next was languages. The chief languages of the Roman world were four: Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. Latin was the language of the law courts and of the literature of Rome. As a popular tongue, it was spoken mostly in the Western Roman world, particularly in North Africa, Spain, Gaul, and Britain, as well as in Italy itself. It was the language of the conquerors and was learned by the subject peoples, who quickly adapted its pronunciation and vocabulary to their own dialects. Greek was the cultural language of the empire, familiar to all educated persons, and was the lingua franca of the majority of the populace from Rome eastward. Even in Palestine, Greek was currently spoken and was probably used by Jesus and by his disciples whenever they had to deal with Gentiles. Aramaic was the predominant tongue of the Near East. Paul addressed the people of Jerusalem in Aramaic, Acts 22:2, when he made his impromptu defense from the steps of the castle of Antonia, and some recorded quotations of Jesus indicate that he used it customarily. John 1:42, Mark 7:34, Matthew 27:46. It appears also in the religious phraseology of the early church, such as Abba, Rom, 8:15, Maranatha, I Corinthians 16:22, showing that the earliest believers spoke Aramaic. Classical Hebrew, to which Aramaic was closely related, had been a dead language since the times of Ezra, except among the learned rabbis who made it a medium for theological thought. It was not understood by the rank and file of the people. The wide use of the first three of these languages is shown by the statement that the inscription on the cross over the head of Jesus was written in Hebrew, and in Latin, and in Greek, John 19:20. Even in Palestine, all three were current and were recognized. Such interchange of language in the center where Christianity originated brought to bear on it the influence of the civilization and literature which these languages represented, and gave to Christianity a means for universal expression. Neither Latin nor Hebrew played a large part in the history of the Church during the 1st century, but Aramaic and Greek did. Tradition says that some of the earliest accounts of the words of Jesus were composed in Aramaic, and the fact that the New Testament as a whole was circulated in Greek almost from the time of its origin is too patent to need comment. All of the epistles were composed in Greek, and the Gospels and Acts have survived only in Greek form. Even if it should be granted that some Aramaic accounts of the words of Jesus were extant in the middle of the 1st century. Next was the science. The Romans, who dominated the world of the 1st century, were not interested primarily in mathematical and in scientific pursuits. They were largely content to confine themselves to such elementary processes as were necessary in the measurement of land or in the calculation of finance. The appliances that they possessed, such as ships for navigation and engines of war, had all been invented by the Greeks, from whom they borrowed. Certain fields of learning had already been explored by the time of Christ. Geometry, literally the science of measuring land, had begun with the Babylonians and with the Egyptians, and was brought to the Greek world by Thales of Miletus, if tradition be correct. Euclid of Alexandria, circa 300 BC, developed plane geometry so completely that his propositions have been studied with little change to the modern day. Mechanics and physics had been investigated by Archimedes of Syracuse, 287 to 212 BC, who developed the theory of the lever and discovered the principle of estimating the composition of bodies by the relation of their weight to the weight of the volume of water that they displaced. He found the formula for the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, and in doing so he discovered the basic approach to calculus. Several of his numerous mechanical devices were used in the wars of Syracuse against Rome. Astronomy made great advances in the pre-Christian world. The sphericity of the Earth and its revolution on its own axis were known to some Greek scientists in the 4th century BC. Hipparchus, circa 160 BC, invented both plane and spherical trigonometry and calculated the size of the Moon and its distance from the Earth. The predominant theory of the motion of the Earth and of the planets was not that all revolved about the Sun, but that the planets revolved around the Earth. Eratosthenes of Alexandria, 273 to 192 BC, calculated the circumference of the Earth to a surprising degree of accuracy in spite of his crude instruments. The science which owed its greatest advance to the period including the 1st century was geography. Ptolemy of Alexandria, A.D. 127 to 151, wrote a work on astronomy which remained the standard until the rise of the Copernican theory in modern times. He created maps of the world which included all regions known at that time. Medicine flourished in various centers of the world. The University of Tarsus had an affiliated hospital in the Temple of Aesculapius, where the sick went to be healed. A school of Greek medicine was begun in Rome during the reign of Augustus. Celsus, a physician, who lived in the reign of Tiberius, wrote a treatise on surgery which showed extensive knowledge of the technique of operating. Another doctor, Dioscorides, wrote a description of some 600 plants and their medical uses. Galen, AD 129 to 200, reduced Greek medical knowledge to a system. He carried on biological experiments and made notes of his discoveries. Although many of his conclusions were erroneous, he exercised a powerful influence on medical science down to the close of the Middle Ages. Such scientific knowledge as the Romans did possess showed little originality or intellectual curiosity. Pliny's Naturalis Historia was an encyclopedia of the learning of his day in 37 volumes. It covered every subject from agriculture to zoology. Pliny drew heavily on other writers as well as on his own observations. He may be regarded as an honest witness to the culture of his times, but he failed to distinguish between fact and fable, so that his conclusions were not always reliable. The Hebrews were not particularly interested in speculative science. In the 1st century none of them were renowned for proficiency in mathematics or in the natural sciences. The Church, which sprang from the matrix of Judaism, did not concern itself with science as such, for its main interests were in the ethical and religious fields. On the other hand, the revelation on which the Church based its teaching was not inherently opposed to science. Paul, speaking of God, says that the invisible things of him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity. Romans 1:20. There is no conflict between the theological investigation of God's revelation through his Spirit and the scientific investigation of his revelation through creation. The New Testament is not primarily a book of science, nor was it written by men whose training could be called scientific in the full modern sense of the term, but it is not anti-scientific either in its statements or in its spirit. Next was the schools. The modern system of free compulsory education by the state for all children under the age of 16 was unknown in the Roman Empire. Not until the time of Vespasian did the rulers take any active interest in supporting public education. The training of the child in the average Roman household began with the paidagogos, a slave who was charged with the responsibility of teaching the child his first lessons and of conducting him to and from one of the private schools in the city where he lived. Up to the time of his acknowledgement as a young man with adult responsibilities, the Roman boy was under the superintendence of his tutor. The schools themselves were rather dreary affairs, held in the public alcoves or halls where the markets and the shops were located. Schoolmasters knew and practiced little of educational psychology, but taught by endless repetition, punctuated with corporal punishment. With rare exceptions, these schoolrooms were bare, chilly, unattractive halls, devoid of the blackboards, charts, decorations, and other equipment regarded as essential to the modern school. The curriculum was essentially practical. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were the basic subjects of the elementary curriculum. As the pupil progressed, he studied the Greek and Latin poets, and memorized long passages which he had to recite with the proper expression. Later he might learn the elements of oratory, how to compose a speech, and how to deliver it convincingly. Sometimes the wealthier youths went abroad to study in the Greek universities of Athens, Rhodes, Tarsus, or Alexandria. Or they might attend the lectures of traveling philosophers. The education of the Jewish boy followed somewhat the same pattern, except that his curriculum was more restricted. He learned to read and to write from the Old Testament. Among the Jews of the dispersion, the synagogue schools doubtless used both Greek and Hebrew. He learned also the traditions of the fathers and was schooled in the ritual of Judaism. In some instances he was permitted to read Gentile literature. If he aspired to become a scholar, he usually went to study with some great rabbi, as Paul received instruction at the feet of Gamaliel according to the strict manner of the law of his fathers, Acts 22-3. No adequate data exist for drawing conclusions concerning the state of education in every comma of the empire. Apparently each municipality of people within its bounds was responsible for its own educational program. The prevalence of writing, however, even in the poorest parts of Egypt as attested by the papyri, shows that a fair degree of literacy was attained by the people of the 1st century and that reading and writing were practiced by the lower classes. Probably the average attainment of the early empire would compare very favorably with that of the Middle Ages, or even with some parts of Europe in the 18th century of the present era. Next were moral standards. The moral condition of the Roman Empire as a whole may not have been as black as some historians have painted it. As usual, the virtuous people went unnoticed because of their virtue and the criminals were singled out for attention. Only crime was news. Nevertheless, all indications in the history, literature, drama, and art that have survived point to a standard of morality generally lower than our own. The tremendous indictment of mankind in Romans 1:18-3:20 was originally directed against the empire, and all available witness supports its accuracy. Moral declension does not mean that no comparatively decent people existed, or that virtue was completely stifled. It does mean that the prevailing trend in society verged downward to indulgence and to lawlessness. Human life was cheap and murder was frequent. Divorce was easy to obtain and was generally accepted in society. The exposure of unwanted infants was a common practice. As illustrated in the well-known letter of Hilarion to his wife, Alice, should you bear a child, if it is a boy, let it live, if it is a girl, expose it. Superstition and trickery of every kind flourished. There were moralists like Seneca, Nero's tutor, who in their writings advocated lofty ideals and spoke words of wisdom. But their protestations made little impact upon the entrenched evils of the day. They imparted to their readers no spiritual dynamic that could make their precepts effective, and, as in the case of Seneca, they did not exemplify their own counsel. Paganism was devoid of any power to lift it above itself, and the growing consciousness of its own impotence brought upon it a pessimism and a depression that it could not escape. Corruption in politics, debauchery in pleasure, fraud in business, deceit and superstition in religion made life in Rome depressing for the many and unendurable for the few.